Well, hello epistemologists. We have a fun topic today. It's a 3-page paper by Edmund Gettier that changed the history of epistemology. This is going to be lots of fun. Strap in. Let's get started. So basically, Gettier's paper is going to come up with a formula for counterexamples to the theory that knowledge is justified true belief. And if you remember from last time, we were talking about knowledge as justified true belief as a kind of version of Plato's classical account of knowledge in the Theaetetus. If you remember in the Theaetetus, the final definition we come to is that knowledge is true judgment with an account. And in contemporary epistemology, that last part, the account part, has been largely replaced by the notion of justification. Justifications are anything that gives me warrant or epistemic support for having a particular belief. That is, that gives me a reason to think that the belief is true. And different theories define justification in different ways, and that's something we'll talk about in future sessions. So we'll talk about views like reliabilism, which says that justification is a kind of reliable connection between myself and the world. We'll talk about evidentialism, which is the view that justification for a belief is something that provides evidence for the belief being true. And we'll talk about a few other theories as well, including theories on which the justification that we have is internal. That is, it depends on my knowing the basis of my belief, for example, and other theories like that. So we won't be defining justification as yet. The important thing to keep in mind as we approach Gettier's counterexamples to the classical knowledge is justified true belief account is just that the classical account has 3 components. So suppose that I claim to know that snow is white. On the classical account, I do know that snow is white if, first of all, it's true that snow is white. Second of all, if I do believe that snow is white. And thirdly, if it is the case that I am justified in believing that snow is white. If all of those 3 conditions hold, that is, if the thing that I believe is true, if I do believe it, and if my belief is justified, then the classical account says that I have knowledge. And Gettier's paper is coming in to show how basically that account is incomplete. Those 3 conditions together are not sufficient conditions for me to have knowledge. And if you remember from earlier on, a sufficient condition is a particular condition that if it's satisfied, it guarantees that that thing for which it's a condition obtains, right? And that's contrasted with a necessary condition. A necessary condition for a particular situation is one that must be satisfied in order for the situation to obtain. The knowledge is justified true belief account has it that justified true beliefs are sufficient for knowledge. Gettier's argument shows that actually they're not. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is that in order to show that a certain set of conditions aren't sufficient for something, all you have to do is find a counterexample to that thing. So literally all that Gettier has to do is to find a counterexample. Find a case in which a particular person has a belief that is true and that is justified, but that on our view does not amount to knowledge. That is, that we get an intuition that it doesn't amount to knowledge. And Gettier does even better than that. He not only finds an example, he kind of creates a way for us to come up with new examples for almost any kind of justification condition that you want to formulate. So basically, if you try to come up with a definition of justification that helps us solve this problem, Gettier thinks he can come up with a counterexample. So let's start with Gettier's original 2 cases, and then I'll bring up some examples, some other cases that people have come up with since Gettier's paper came out. So here's his first case. 2 people, call them S and J, have interviewed for a job. S knows that J has 10 coins in their pocket. S has been told by the company president that J will get the job. S therefore believes, quote, the person who will get the job has 10 coins in their pocket. As a matter of fact, S will get the job, not J. S does have 10 coins in his pocket, so his belief is true. That is to say, he is correct that the person who's going to get the job has 10 coins in their pocket, but it's kind of accidental that they're believing truly that thing, because as it turns out, the person that they believed had 10 coins in their pocket is not the one that is going to get the job. In fact, they themselves are going to get the job, and it just so happens that they have 10 coins in their pocket. So that's an example on which S has a justified belief. They have good reason to believe the thing that they believe, and the belief happens to be true, but it's not sufficient for us to think that S knows that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in their pocket, right? Because it's kind of an accident. So here's a second case that Gettier gives us. I've always seen J with a Ford, so I believe that J owns a Ford. Any true proposition can be put in a disjunction in such a way that the disjunction will be true. So knowing this, I also believe, 1, either J owns a Ford or my friend B is in Barcelona. 2, either J owns a Ford or B is in Boston. 3, either J owns a Ford or B is in Brest-Litovsk. As a matter of fact, J is currently driving a rented car. However, B really is in Barcelona, so number 1 is true anyway. So here we see how the true belief that I have is completely accidental, because it was the other side of the disjunction which had to be true if the first half of the disjunct was true. Turns out to have been true anyway, because the first half of the disjunct is false, but the second half of the disjunct happens to be true, and I happen to believe it. Now that's not the way that we usually form beliefs, but it does show how there's a case in which my belief is true, and I'm justified in believing it. I've just followed some basic rules of logic. But nonetheless, we don't think that my belief amounts to knowledge. There's a gap between the justified true belief account and the correct account, if there is one, of what knowledge is. Because if justified true belief account were the correct account of knowledge, then I would just count as knowing. But as we've seen with these two examples, I can't count as knowing, because both of these cases are cases in which we would say, I don't know, or S doesn't know. Now here are two other examples come up with by people who are not Gettier. One of these is an example by Chisholm. So Chisholm says, someone is standing outside, looking at a field. They see what they think is a sheep, and think to themselves, there's a sheep in the field. Unfortunately for them, the sheep they're looking at is in fact a dog disguised as a sheep, a cleverly disguised dog. But unbeknownst to them, there is actually another sheep in the field. It's just like sort of out of view, off to one side. That's a case in which, again, and this seems like a naturalistic case, the person looking at the field has a justified belief. They have reasons to believe there are sheep in the field. There is what looks to be very much like a sheep out there in the field, but it's actually not a sheep. But accidentally, their belief is true anyway, because there is a sheep in the field. It's just not the creature they were looking at. It's a different thing that makes it true that there's a sheep in the field. So they have a belief, it is justified, it is true, but we don't think that it's knowledge. That person doesn't know that there's sheep in the field. And here's a final example that I'll give. This one is by Alvin Goldman, whose paper on reliabilism we're going to read for next time. Someone is driving around the countryside, maybe around here in the Hudson Valley, right? So just imagine someone driving a car through the hills, and there also appear to be lots of barns in this area. The person points to a building and says to their friend, there's a barn there. I mean, kind of an innocuous thing to say, but we say things like this all the time to each other. As a matter of fact, it is a real barn. However, the friends have been driving around a small patch of the valley that's used as a movie set, and all the other apparent barns are actually fake. So it's just kind of lucky that this friend happened to point to the one barn that was real. Had they pointed like slightly off to one side, they would have pointed at a fake barn, and their assertion that that is a barn there would have been false. And so we have a case in which they've got a true belief and it's justified, but we don't think that they have knowledge because they didn't know that they're driving around fake barn country. They didn't know they were driving around a movie set. Had they known they were driving around a movie set, they wouldn't have believed the thing that they believed. In a sense, they don't have knowledge because it was accidental that they got it right. So all of these are supposed to be counterexamples to different ways of conceiving of how it is that we come to have justification for a belief. All of these cases are cases in which ordinarily you would think the person is totally justified in believing what they believe, or they have a kind of special connection between the facts in the world and their belief, right? Like in the sheepdog case. Same thing in fake barn country. You know, my perception is telling me that there's a barn out there, and in this case it's right, but my perception would have also told me that there was a barn there when there's just a fake barn there. So it feels like knowledge is very dependent on the thing being true, in a sense, non-accidentally, but the justification definitions I've tried to come up with so far just aren't the right kind to get me a guarantee that if I'm justified in believing something and it's true, that therefore it's knowledge. So it just feels like there's some magic dust or something that we're missing. So maybe you think to yourself, okay, right, like knowledge is true plus belief plus some other thing. We just need to specify that other thing in such a way that we don't come up with these counterexamples. We need to specify justification in some way that we'd say that a certain case of knowledge is only one where you have that thing, that account of justification, plus truth, plus belief. And so for a long time, that's what philosophers thought. They thought that they could come up with a way to get over these Gettier cases, these counterexamples, and just formulate a principle in such a way that there wasn't a Gettier counterexample to it. But after actually a couple decades of trying this, certain people started to get really, really frustrated. Some of them abandoned the attempt altogether. And a particular philosopher by the name of Zagzebski basically said, there is no way to avoid Gettier counterexamples. Almost any time that you try to give an analysis of knowledge into its sufficient conditions, you're going to come up short. At least as long as the truth condition, that is the condition that says the belief must be true, is separable from the justification condition, the condition that says that you have good reason to believe that the belief is true. So here's Zagzebski in her 1994 paper. She argues that in spite of the many attempts to specify the justification condition in a new way, Gettier problems are inescapable. There's no way out. There's no way to specify justification without getting into trouble. This is because, she says, justification and truth aren't linked together, right, by necessity. Anytime that you make these conditions independent, they're going to come apart enough that a Gettier counterexample can kind of squeeze in. She says, and I quote, "I shall argue that given the common and reasonable assumption that the relation between justification and truth is close but not inviolable, it is not possible for either move to avoid Gettier counterexamples. I conclude that Gettier problems are inescapable for virtually every analysis of knowledge, which at least maintains that knowledge is true belief plus something else." And what she says is that Gettier cases are frequently generated by a case of accidental epistemic good luck canceling out a case of epistemic bad luck in such a way that the belief is true but does not amount to knowledge. This means that Zagzebski thinks that you can generate Gettier cases for any attempted analysis of knowledge. Therefore, quote, "the conclusion is that as long as the concept of knowledge closely connects the justification component and the truth component, but permits some degree of independence between them, justified true belief will never be sufficient for knowledge." And she goes through and gives counterexamples to two different accounts proposed since the Gettier paper came out that show basically how each of these accounts of what knowledge is, trying to analyze knowledge into its components, both of them fail. And I'll only go over one of them for now, but maybe you can study the other one in the paper and we can talk about it at a later date. So one attempted analysis of knowledge was one done by Alvin Plantinga, who's an epistemologist, and he had a theory on which something amounts to knowledge if it is a belief and it is true and you have warrant, what he calls warrant, for believing in it. And how do we define Plantinga's notion of warrant? Warrant, he says, is the property a belief B has for a particular believer, call them S, when B, the belief, is produced in the person S by S's faculties working properly in the appropriate environment, according to a design plan successfully aimed at truth. So the idea is, I have warrant for a particular belief if I'm using, say, my God-given faculties in the way they've been designed and they're working properly in the right environment for which they're constructed. And if they're in that environment, then I'm almost guaranteed that my beliefs are going to come out as true. So suppose that, like, and this is just an example, suppose that God made my perceptual faculties and he designed me so that I work in a particular kind of environment, like say a naturalistic environment, one in which I'm surrounded by nature and squirrels and birds and stuff. And that perceptual faculty is pretty darn good at identifying like fruit in my environment. So I'm in this environment and I have these faculties and I'm forming beliefs. I'm in exactly the right place for this type of faculty to work. And so when I form the belief that there's a fruit over there, I am generally correct. And so I have warrant for that belief in that situation. And basically Plantinga is saying that if my belief has warrant and it's true, then I have knowledge. Any case like that is a case on which I have knowledge. So he's just giving kind of an alternative to justification here. He's calling it warrant. And here's Zagzebski's counterexample to Plantinga. Suppose that there's this woman named Mary. She lives in this house with her husband, and she looks across the room toward the living room, and there's a man sitting in an armchair in the living room, and she forms the belief, oh, my husband's in the living room. Unbeknownst to her, that person in the living room is in fact not her husband. It's actually her husband's brother, who looks a lot like him. She had thought her husband's brother was, I don't know, in Australia, but as a matter of fact, he's in her house. And you could think that maybe she has a false belief that's warranted, but actually it just so happens that her husband is in the living room. He's just sort of out of eyesight, off to one side. So she has warrant for believing her husband's in the living room, and in fact he is in the living room, but we didn't want to say that she has knowledge that he's in the living room. Why? Well, because in this case, she got lucky. She would have formed the wrong belief, even though most things were working in her favor. It's just pure accident that she would have gotten it wrong, but it's also pure accident that in this case she got it right anyway. So Mary has warrant for her belief, and her belief is true, but it doesn't amount to knowledge. So we found a Gettier counterexample to Plantinga's account of warrant as the sufficient condition for knowledge. Well, gee, Professor O, now what do we do? Suppose that you were all excited and optimistic that there was a positive account that you could give, a positive account of the analysis of knowledge. Maybe you left the Theaetetus thinking like, oh, if we just sit here and think long and hard enough, we're gonna come up with a way to solve this. And then Gettier comes in and just sort of knocks our beautiful glass house down. It's shattered. There's nothing left. Where do we go from here? Well, Zagzebski does offer some ways out, and we'll see in future lessons that some people take some of these ways out, but we can also maybe start to see and maybe ask yourself why someone might not want to take these particular ways out of this problem. So she suggests 3 ways out. Here's the first way out. Basically, give up the idea that the justification condition and the truth condition are independent. Justification would be defined in such a way that there is no false belief that can satisfy it. So only true beliefs will end up counting as justified. How? I don't know, there's just a magic dust. Anytime that you have justification, it must only be in a case where there is truth to the thing that you're justified in believing. Otherwise, you don't have justification at all. Just specify justification in such a way that it ties like so solidly to truth that they don't come apart. So knowledge would just be justified belief. You don't even have to talk about truth because the justification condition would just kind of guarantee truth. Now, when Zagzebski wrote this paper in 1994, this was not a very popular view. There might be some people who believe something like it now. So let's let's discuss that when it comes up later in the semester. The other way out of the three, the second way out that Zagzebski suggests, is maybe we could make the justification condition and the truth condition almost completely independent. So the opposite. Basically, in the first way out, we made justification and truth be like basically married to each other. They're like inseparable. They're like, they can't even be divorced. They're just linked. They're like solidified, welded together. In the second way out, the justification and the truth condition are made completely and totally apart. They're like kept at arm's length from each other. So justification could still put the subject in the best position available for getting at the truth, but if the best position is just not very good, then most justified beliefs will be false. So what that means is, on Zagzebski's view, is that luck wouldn't negate cases of knowledge, basically. So if you're lucky in being right, you would still count as knowing, because justification will sort of put you in a really, really, really good position, but it won't guarantee truth. But accident won't like completely negate that you know. So the Gettier cases would no longer count as counterexamples to knowledge. We just say, yeah, all of those cases are cases in which you know, even if you only know kind of accidentally. That's fine. Let's move on. So basically that's the second strategy, is to say, I'm not fazed by the Gettier counterexamples. All of those examples are cases in which you know. Fight me, Gettier. So the third way out is perhaps an attractive one, but it'll have some downsides. And that is that you could just add a condition, a fourth condition on knowledge. It's not truth, it's not belief, it's not justification, it's a luck condition. Basically, knowledge is true plus belief plus justification or warrant or whatever you want to call it, plus luck. Basically, we just shrug and say, you know what? Gettier is right. There are lots of cases in which your belief can be true and it can be justified, but it's not knowledge yet just because you have bad epistemic luck. So we'll just build it in. We'll just say, unfortunately, there's just always going to be some magic sprinkle of, universal coincidence that makes it be the case that sometimes you know and sometimes you don't. There's just a bit of it that's out of your control, and we'll just stick that into our analysis of knowledge so you can have knowledge, but it sort of depends on getting lucky. Sometimes you won't know, and it's not your fault. You did the best you could. You just got unlucky. And sometimes you do know, and maybe you weren't even working very hard. It's just accidental. You're just right, and you got lucky. And that's just how the world works. That's just the place we're in. Epistemology can only do some of the work. The rest of the work has to be done by the world. The end. And that position sounds kind of attractive in a certain way because it acknowledges the role of accident, but it also makes us a little bit uncomfortable because as epistemologists, one of the things we wanted to do is to figure out how to make ourselves think in a better way, polish our minds up, sharpen them so that we're more able to grasp the truth more of the time. And acknowledging that there's a large luck condition to knowledge is basically saying that we can work our whole entire lives, but it's not entirely up to us whether or not we're right in the end. All going to be a crapshoot some of the time. It's a little bit more like playing poker than like doing mathematics, maybe. Or even less than that. It's even less than playing poker. It's like playing blackjack. It's a little bit chancier. Sometimes you're even just rolling the dice, right? Some people who are not even very good at math can win at blackjack. And maybe that's just what knowledge is. Sometimes people know stuff, even if they don't know the rules of the game. What do you think? Which of those three ways out do you like? Or, and this is still an open option, because remember, there's always another way. We could try to go back and find out if there's something wrong with Gettier cases. Is Gettier kind of putting us in a corner that we didn't consent to go into? Is there another way that we haven't thought of to squirm out of the Gettier problem? Maybe Zagzebski's right, and there is no way out. Or maybe she's wrong, and Gettier's wrong, and there is an analysis of knowledge that we can use. There is a sense in which we can come up with a definition of justification that will get us out of this labyrinth. So tune in next time and we'll talk about Goldman's theory of reliabilism, which is one way of trying to think of justification that he thinks is more Gettier proof. Is it totally Gettier foolproof? Well, no, because we can come up with Gettier examples, maybe, that show how it doesn't work. But there is an interesting element to this reliabilist account of knowledge, and in part it was formulated as a response to Gettier problems. So let's see how well it does. Thanks for joining in, and see you soon.